These pictures were taken on a holiday when everything else was closed. They're less than a mile from each other. The manager of the boutique meat shop in this photo said the spa next door is open when he arrives in the morning and still open when he leaves at night, and they have a steady flow of customers. We're going to review the topic of illicit massage businesses and much more during this presentation. Let's get started. Hi, my name's Alan Herrick. I'm Vice President of S.O.M Therapy and Associates, and this is a narrated slideshow. We'll get some basic information out of the way before beginning, and don't forget you can always pause the video if you need to take notes. S.O.M Therapy is an approved NCB-TMB provider. We're also sponsored by NCB-TMB as a provider for New York LMTs. We're approved by the Florida Board as well as the Louisiana Board of Massage Therapy. States that accept NCB-TMB will also accept our CEs. Human trafficking for sex and labor is a global problem, but as you can see from the graphic, the United States is a magnet due to its prosperity and some would say lacks authority with regard to enforcement and penalties. The issue crosses boundaries of age because not only young people are trafficked, and the effects are felt on all generations. Gender, women and men are trafficked for sex and labor, as we'll see. Ethnicity, as the map a few tiles back showed, it's global. Social and economic origin do not matter either. Rich and poor can be caught, depending on the circumstances. There are two basic categories of trafficking, sex and labor, but they often overlap. Sometimes this can complicate the statistics, but in the real world, for the people living it, it's still just slavery. Here's what's clear though. Trafficking overwhelmingly affects adult women, and a great deal of trafficking occurs to U.S. citizens. It's worth mentioning before we go further that 18 years of age is considered an adult, so even people, when caught, they may be 18, it's quite possible they've been trafficked as a pre-adult. It's been long established that human trafficking in all its forms is modern-day slavery, but when it comes to the sex industry and victims under the age of 18, the definition is a little different. There are three criteria that, according to the law, make sex work and illegal labor trafficking. There's force, fraud, and coercion. If any of these elements are present, the law says that is human trafficking. I mentioned earlier the age threshold for being an adult, right? Well, it's also important for you to know that while adult women were the most counted statistically, girls ranging from 9 to 14 years of age are still the most vulnerable. And in these cases, force, fraud, and coercion need not be present. If someone is caught with a minor, they can be automatically charged with human trafficking. That's right. Go directly to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. We're going to review both labor and sex trafficking, but separately. Some of the vulnerabilities are the same, but the two types deserve separate attention. I think you'll see why as we progress. Sex trafficking is around us in a variety of ways, and some are more subtle than others. Here are the 5 methods of sex trafficking: residential brothels, escort services, strip clubs, street prostitution, and fake massage businesses. They all contribute to sex trafficking. And you might think of them as different storefronts for different kinds of customers. So let's begin with residential brothels. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, residential brothels are a sort of informal, underground business. They can be in a home or an apartment complex, a condominium, even a trailer park, which may have been your first guess, but all these places have been documented as being used. It can be an urban setting, suburban, or even rural, wherever there is an opportunity for exploitation. But the business is never what Hollywood and the media would have you believe. Movies with titles like Memoir of a Geisha, Beauty of the Day, Pretty Baby, and Heaven's Gate all address brothels and sex trafficking, but they sugarcoat it, romanticize it, and omit the true dangers and short lifespan of most people involved. Let's take a look at who the victims are. Victims are required to live and sleep at the brothel's location 24/7 with limited ability to leave the residence. They're first and foremost overwhelmingly female. They're often forced to service high volumes of men daily. In these residential brothel networks, the victims are mostly from Latin America. They're often recruited or tricked into the network by traffickers posing as boyfriends who feign romance and affection. Others are recruited in their home countries by false job promises in the U.S. Women already living in the U.S. are also targeted by the same methods and through false printed advertisements. Two common vulnerabilities among victims in residential brothels are their immigration status and economic hardship. Frequently, these women are undocumented. They may have come to the U.S. on a legitimate visa or a fake visa provided to them by traffickers. They also could have been smuggled across the border. In many cases, their passport or ID was confiscated or is being held by a friend, who is usually the trafficker, which increases their vulnerability. Without legal status, women frequently are taught by traffickers to fear and distrust the police and government authorities. Residential brothel networks often target women experiencing financial hardship also. They exploit the women's need to care financially for themselves and for their families. There can be other reasons, but these two are capitalized on by traffickers. And they use several methods. First and foremost, force, complete isolation in the residential brothel, regular and frequent transportation to other brothels or other cities by drivers working for the trafficking network, restrictions on communication to family, physical or sexual abuse, forced abortions, lack of general health care as well as the reproductive health care. Also, fraud, false promises of a better life, false promises by a trafficker presenting as a boyfriend. And then there's coercion, which can be debt manipulation, threats of harm to the victim or the victim's family, threats to shame the victim by revealing the commercial sex to their family and others in their community, threats of deportation and arrest, confiscation of passports and visas, and rumors of or witnessed violence at the hands of the traffickers are all used as threats. You might wonder, who are these bad people, the traffickers? Well, residential brothels are generally decentralized systems run by criminal organizations, and they operate transnationally. Most residential brothels are closed networks in that they target victim populations that match their customer bases. They share a cultural and ethnic background. As mentioned a moment ago, for example, the NHTRC has received reports of residential brothels catering to the Latino community. Law enforcement refers to these as LRBs. The traffickers in these networks are from Central America and Mexico and have connections with the families or are from the same hometowns as the victims. Alternatively, we've heard of Armenian, Chinese, and other ethnic versions operating in multiple cities throughout our country. Residential brothels often rely on extra security and supervision to control the victim's movements and activities. Individuals who support the operation are referred to as facilitators. They are individuals who take on specific roles. Facilitators are connected to the traffickers in differing degrees and may or may not have knowledge of the day-to-day operations of the trafficking network. Tasks include transportation, recruitment, surveillance, and enforcement. Rather than advertising online or through newspapers, residential brothels distribute business cards, or called tarjetas, and also publicize their existence through word of mouth. Business cards and printed advertisements are frequently disguised as an alternative business, using code language to indicate how to access the network. In one Denver community, neighbors took to heart the advice, "See something, say something." According to a local news station report, when neighbors noticed an increase in traffic in the neighborhood and to one house in particular, they contacted authorities and soon discovered their suspicions were correct. When it was all said and done, a grand jury handed down an 8-count indictment against a pair of in-laws accused of running a residential brothel out of a Denver home. Investigators accused Zhao Li Gao, 51, and Zhongwei Zhang, 49, of laundering money received from a prostitution operation through a nearby Chinese fake massage business that Gao owned. During the spring and summer of 2018, women were rotated through the house on a regular basis to perform prostitution inside. These women rarely left the residence except for when they were moved from the home at the end of their stay. Gao and Zhang are facing charges related to pimping and prostitution, in addition to money laundering, filing a false tax return, and violating the Colorado Organized Crime Control Act. A surveillance camera outside of the home captured video of 257 men who came and went from the home and stayed for 30 minutes or less between March and August of 2018. That's just the ones that got on camera. That averages out to be 51 men per month. The article also mentions that the Denver District Attorney said prosecuting the financial crimes will help protect the alleged victims from having to testify, and that the Denver Police Chief Paul Pazin said his department is also working to avoid re-victimizing sex trafficking victims. Oftentimes, it's the victim of the sex traffic industry that is the one that is getting the handcuffs put on and getting prosecuted, and we want to make sure that we're holding the people that are exploiting vulnerable populations accountable. This was a great example of citizens making a difference in their community. Moving on to the next category of sex trafficking, escort services. They've been around for a very long time. They used to advertise in the classified section of the newspapers. Some of you may be old enough to remember when the classified section was as thick as some other sections. These days, that's long gone because it's now all moved online. There's only digital ads and word of mouth, and those are the standard for escorts. There are many entrepreneurs, and I use air quotes as I say this, out there these days making their way as escorts, but the relative anonymity that the internet and one-on-one services provides makes it an attractive business model for human traffickers as well. Once the victim is under their control, they can send them out for work. This type of transaction pays better than the residential brothel, but it's also riskier because the victim is outside the domain of their physical control. Technically, an escort service is not the same as prostitution. That's right, I said it, but the term escort has been twisted so far from its original meaning, it's now mostly just a euphemism for prostitution. If they're not being invited to a house, hotels and motels are common venues due to ease of access for buyers. The ability to still pay cash for a room and maintain secrecy of finances, and the lack of facility maintenance or upkeep expenses, often unbeknownst to hotel management. The service has two models, out calls and in calls. The price can vary depending on where the transaction takes place and for how long the escort stays. One thing is sure, though, the victim never gets any of the money. Their needs are usually provided for by a manager or pimp who's careful not to allow them to have money because it would also give them independence. Individuals who involuntarily participate in escort services have sometimes been taken advantage of through vulnerabilities like homelessness or prior violence and assault. Runaway and homeless youth may be particularly at risk of sex trafficking. A study by Covenant House found that 48% of interviewed youth that had experienced sex trafficking had initially engaged in commercial sex because they didn't have a place to stay. Persons who have experienced prior violence and sex assault have an increased risk of sex trafficking. And according to a study by the Illinois Criminal Justice Authority, victims who experience repeated violent acts may unconsciously normalize victimization or be unable to see alternative possibilities. Victims of street-based commercial sex are known to be vulnerable to violence and assault from buyers. Although victims of sex trafficking and escort and street sex are commonly monitored by their captor, that person is often less visible and therefore more difficult for police to investigate. Commercial sex in hotels or motels becomes trafficking when force, fraud, or coercion are used to maintain control over the person providing commercial sex services and cause the person to engage in commercial sex acts. According to reports from the Human Trafficking Hotline website, over 78% of escort prostitution occurs in hotels and motels. And just remember, anyone under the age of 18 is considered a victim of sex trafficking, regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. Places that are making a legitimate business out of escorting are adding pages and links to help resources on their websites to minimize their liability and to heighten awareness of the problem of sex trafficking. Here's an example pulled from a well-known escort service site. You can see they've tagged the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Polaris Project, Homeland Security is on there, as well as a warning of what to look out for possible human trafficking, including does the entertainer appear to be underage or close to underage. Strip clubs are another venue used for sex trafficking. Victims of sex trafficking are frequently recruited to ostensibly work in strip clubs across the United States. Women, men, and minors are recruited. They work as hostesses, servers, or dancers, but then are required to provide commercial sex to customers. Individuals forced to serve but not required to provide commercial sex may still be victims of labor trafficking. Strip clubs are designed to provide the space and environment in which buyers may purchase commercial sex. Victims of sex trafficking in strip clubs must adhere to extensive predetermined schedules and are frequently moved between multiple clubs. Commercial sex sometimes takes place in the bathroom, a VIP or lap dance rooms, or arrangements are made for off-site in hotels or buyers' homes. The traffickers may be the business owners, shift leaders, fake massage business managers, brothel managers, or independent traffickers. Often clubs and bars involved in sex trafficking offer commercial sex through escort services, massage parlors, or brothels that are connected to the bar or located nearby. Strip club owners generally consider the women to be independent contractors or employees of the escort manager driving network, not the club, and they often require women to pay a house fee to the club for the space to perform. The facilitators are often drivers who transport women to and from the clubs and the appointments. One example is the '99 Mel Gibson movie Payback. These drivers and operators typically require fees to be paid for transportation, and the drivers use town cars or large passenger vans to transport victims from club to club or across state lines to new networks. Other possible facilitators include the staff in the strip club. They use methods of control over the victims or set up arrangements for commercial sex with the customers. Vendors who may knowingly or unknowingly provide space, service, or products for the businesses to maintain the front of a legitimate business. Licensing or inspection personnel who are aware of the legal commercial sex aspect of the business. And sources of advertising for business, such as online websites. All are facilitators. The victims in strip clubs may be U.S. citizens or foreign nationals with valid visas, expired fraudulent visas, or just without documentation. There have been connections with stripping networks made to Russian organized crime. They recruit Russian or Eastern European women to come to the United States to work in go-go clubs and strip clubs. Once here, a network of drivers transport the women to and from the clubs where they work and the group houses where they live and pay inflated rent. These types of networks often target victims of a particular cultural or ethnic background, and it's very often similar to the demographics of the customer base. Recruiters identify susceptible victims from these communities and then offer to move them to the United States for better opportunities, typically under false pretenses. Their shared cultural background often offers the traffickers an avenue for building trust and rapport with the victims during the recruitment phase and for reinforcing control after recruitment. Prior debts. Organized crime networks seeking to recruit victims for sex trafficking in strip clubs often target women and girls who have debt or family with debt to the network. Women from overseas are also required to pay huge recruitment or modeling and travel fees before coming to the United States. They often do so with the expectation that the work promised to them will quickly help them recoup the cost of recruitment. Problem is, their debts only grow once they arrive, as they're required to pay unrealistic housing, transportation fees, along with fees to the club, stage managers, bartenders, bouncers, and all the other facilitators. In one current case, the mayor of Jacksonville is proactively stepping between strip clubs and sex trafficking by getting a local law passed that raises the minimum age to work as a stripper from 18 to 21. Local strip clubs aren't happy about it, but it sends a clear message from the community that underage stripping and the potential for sex trafficking are not welcome. Another case in Nevada, the Reno City Council has banned women under the age of 21 from working in local gentlemen's clubs. Both are being challenged in court, so we'll have to wait and see how that all turns out. Street prostitution follows closely with escort services, the two main differences being between working literally on the street and that the victims engage with the buyers for a shorter period of time. Typically, street prostitutes are purchased for a sex act and then they're finished, whereas an escort may be expected to stay with or accompany their buyer for a longer period of time. According to the State Department's Bureau of Government Affairs, the U.S. government adopted a strong position against legalized prostitution in December of 2002 with a National Security Presidential Directive. They stated that based on evidence that prostitution is inherently harmful and dehumanizing and fuels trafficking in persons, it will be considered a form of modern-day slavery. Prostitution and related activities include pimping and patronizing or maintaining brothels. They fuel the growth of modern-day slavery by providing a facade behind which traffickers for sexual exploitation operate. Where prostitution is legalized or tolerated, there is a greater demand for human trafficking victims and nearly always an increase in the number of women and children trafficked into commercial sex slavery. Of the estimated 600 to 800,000 people trafficked across international borders annually, 80% of the victims are female and up to 50% are minors. Hundreds of thousands of women and children are used in prostitution each year. Women and children want to escape. The vast majority of women in prostitution don't want to be there. Few seek it out or choose it, and most are desperate to leave. A 2003 study, first published in the Scientific Journal of Trauma Practice, found that 89% of women in prostitution want to escape. Despite international covenants and protocols between countries that criminalizes the trafficking and sexual exploitation of children, they are also, too often, discovered trapped in this horrible slavery. Prostitution is inherently harmful. Few activities are as brutal and damaging to people as prostitution. Field research in 9 countries concluded that 60 to 75% of women in prostitution were raped, 70 to 95% were physically assaulted, and 68% met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. That's in the same range as treatment-seeking combat vets. Beyond this shocking abuse, the public health implications of prostitution are devastating and include a myriad of serious and fatal diseases, including HIV/AIDS. A path-breaking 5-country academic study also concluded that research on prostitution has overlooked the burden of physical injuries and illnesses that women in the sex industry sustain, from the violence inflicted on them or from their significantly higher rates of hepatitis B, higher risks of cervical cancer, fertility complications, and psychological trauma. State attempts to regulate prostitution by introducing medical checkups or licenses don't address the core problem, which is the routine abuse and violence that form the prostitution experience. They brutally victimize those caught in its netherworld. Prostitution leaves women and children physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually devastated. Recovery takes years, even decades. Often, the damage cannot be undone. Legalization of prostitution expands the market for commercial sex, opening markets for criminal enterprises and creating a safe haven for criminals who traffic people into prostitution. Organized crime networks do not register with the government, they do not pay taxes, and do not protect prostitutes. Legalization simply makes it easier for them to blend in with a purportedly regulated sex sector and makes it more difficult for prosecutors to identify and punish those who are trafficking people. The Swedish government has found that much of the vast profit generated by the global prostitution industry goes into the pockets of human traffickers. The Swedish government said that the international trafficking in humans could not flourish but for the existence of local prostitution markets where men are willing to and able to buy and sell women and children for sexual exploitation. To fight human trafficking and promote equality for women, Sweden has aggressively prosecuted customers, pimps, and brothel owners since 1999. As a result, 2 years after the new policy, there was a 50% decrease in women prostituting and a 75% decrease in men buying sex. Trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation decreased as well. In contrast, pop culture would have you believe that street prostitution is of choice and that these people can quit whenever they want. It's one of many myths. Here are a few others. Myth number 1. If the trafficked person consented to be in their initial situation, then it cannot be human trafficking or against their will because they knew better. The reality is, initial consent to commercial sex or a labor setting prior to acts of force, fraud, or coercion, or if the victim is a minor in a sex trafficking situation, is not relevant to the crime, nor is payment. Myth number 2, people being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations, locked in, held against their will. The reality, that is sometimes the case. More often, people in trafficking situations stay for reasons that are more complicated. Some lack the basic necessities to physically get out, like transportation or a safe place to live. Some are afraid for their safety. Some have been so effectively manipulated that they don't identify at that point as being under the control of another person. Myth number 3, traffickers target victims they don't know. Many survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, including spouses, and by family members, including parents. It's pitiful. Fake massage businesses. Law enforcement believes there are over 9,000 illicit massage businesses currently operating in the United States. The New York Times claims it's a $3 billion with a B industry. This figure is consistent with research by Vanessa Boucher, a political science professor at Texas Christian University, who found that the illicit massage industry in the city of Houston alone was $107 million per year. Also, the Florida Department of Health disciplined 62 massage parlors or therapists last fiscal year, up from 14 the year before. The agency receives upward of 300 complaints about unlicensed activity in unlicensed massage facilities each year. On to the "it might be fake if" department. Have you ever walked past a massage establishment or a sign that advertised a rate that seemed too good to be true? It likely was. Prices that are significantly below market level, like $20 for an hour massage, in a city where $80 is the norm, should be a red flag. These businesses often use the sign to publicly announce their intentions in a way that gets the attention of men. Once in the room, they're offered, or they simply ask for, additional services. That's where the victim gets the real money. The cost can range from $45 up to $400. These fake massage businesses are hiding in plain sight. Owners and managers can always claim ignorance of the additional services offered by employees behind closed doors. What time is it? Have you ever been driving home from a late movie and seen one of these signs lit up? What massage therapist that you know does massages at 11:30 at night? Another tip, the sign that indicates the entrance and parking is around back. Here's a photo of a nondescript building. Looks like the second floor windows are actually missing. Notice all the security cameras? This photo is of an actual underground massage parlor. Inevitably, the shades or curtains are tightly closed. Often the tinting is so dark in the door that it's impossible to see in. Likely that door is locked also. just in case. Once busted, law enforcement inevitably comments about fully stocked refrigerators or seeing the women cooking outside the back door of the establishment. Definitely not office snacks. Mattresses in the office. Some police reports stated that the victims were actually sleeping on the massage tables. Luggage means they are being trafficked. They won't be there long, though. Traffickers move their victims in as short a time as a week. Definitely not. Owners and managers can claim ignorance of the additional services offered by employees, but the evidence gathered during raids and searches often tells a far different tale. The police say it's common to find ledgers tracking the number of dates women have had, as was found in a bust in Dallas in 2016. And in one case in Kansas, a search of the premises yielded a notebook with handwritten Chinese to English translations that included, "Did you bring a condom?" and "Happy ending." Illicit massage businesses make a lot of cash. They are a parasite on our communities. That money could be paying bills or feeding families. Not only do we need to stop the traffickers, the demand for this type of business has to be stopped. This graphic summarizes the reasons victims stay in the life. The intangibles of fear and shame are probably the strongest. Not knowing what the options are outside of this kind of imprisonment is also a factor. And that's why campaigns like this one in Florida to educate healthcare workers is so important. You can't personally kick in doors and take victims away from their captors, but you can make the knowledge of options more visible. You can talk about it with others, educate, like you're being educated, post the signs. With regards to fake and illicit massage businesses, your first option is so easy. Drop a dime on the offenders. Here's the number to report unlicensed activity. Write it down, 877-HALT-ULA. It's that easy. Maybe just as easy, you can write a brief email to haltula@floridahealth.gov. I'll quote Edmund Burke here, and I'm sure you've heard this before. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. Well, we've covered all we can with the time we have about sex trafficking. We still need to go over labor trafficking. Take a look at these pictures. You may not get out in the country to see forced labor picking strawberries, but all of us have been to a restaurant where the help was distinctly not local. Perhaps you've been to a client's house where a housekeeper was from another country. Have you driven past a job site and seen foreign workers? The question arises, are they working under force, fraud, or coercion? Labor trafficking occurs every day right under our noses. Domestic work is one example. These workers perform for their work in their employers' homes and provide services like cooking, cleaning, child care, elder care, and gardening. They might even live in a separate part of the house or in a cottage on the property. Victims of domestic servitude commonly work 10 to 16-hour days with little to no pay. They may be U.S. citizens or illegal immigrants or foreign nationals with specific visa types. You may hear the visas referred to as A3, G5, NATO 7, or B1. That's how they get in the country, and often at the mercy of someone of their own nationality. But domestic servitude in the U.S. is mostly foreign national women living in the homes of their employers. Men and boys can also be victims, but these cases are less common. Farm and agricultural work. Many farms are large and out of the way from resources like medical help, grocery stores, and other types of supply stores. Once on the land, the owner can trick or demand the workers turn over their visas and passports. Because they have little knowledge of American employment law, they may be easily tricked into a compromising position. The wage agreements may not be honored and/or the workers may be detained, forced to work excessively long hours, and even assaulted. The fear of losing permission to work in the U.S. and the loss of desperately needed money for family back home keeps them locked in this environment. Threats to their families can also be used. In most cases, workers, and this is not exclusively farm workers, don't see themselves as victims of trafficking. They often think of themselves as just someone who made bad choices, and if they were raised in it, they may even think this is how everyone's life is to one degree or another. Factory work is another venue with vulnerabilities that can make trafficking possible. Again, where there is a way for someone to make a dollar by exploiting their fellow human beings, it's usually happening. The garment industry and food processing are two manufacturing industries well known for using trafficked labor. These can be men, women, or even children. They're often forced to work 12-hour days, 6 or even 7 days a week. The garment industry includes sewing, assembling, pressing, and packing. In food processing, it's the slaughtering, preserving, canning, and packing of goods or food for distribution. If the workers are immigrants, they can be documented or undocumented. Many of the same methods of force, fraud, and coercion are used. They're not unique to a particular industry. Rather, they're the common methods of manipulators and exploiters the world over. Physical confinement in locked factories or plants, placement in specific production lines, tasks that the worker can't abandon, physical or sexual abuse, and constant surveillance, lack of medical treatment for work-related injuries or illness. These are all considered methods of force. Things that we would never stand for, like misrepresentation of work, poor working conditions, lying about or cheating workers out of their wages and immigration benefits, payment schemes that compensate workers by units of production rather than hourly wage, and thus grossly underpay their workers. Some manufacturing plants facing complaints may close down and relocate somewhere else without even paying the workers for their labor. There's also altered and fake contracts and visa fraud. Despite how terrible all this is, the industry itself perpetuates it. The competition here with cheap goods from overseas, where people are working for much less, drives the demand for cheap labor here in the U.S. Traffickers, trying to satisfy the demand here, often coerce their victims into working in high production, low profit operations for very little or sometimes no pay. True slavery. In many instances, the system is set up to where retailers and buyers are far removed from the manufacturing. They're unable to directly monitor the factory. Subcontractors who arrange the actual labor are responsible for paying and supervising workers, but can easily fall outside the scope of retailer-manufacturer agreements governing overtime, workplace safety, discrimination harassment, and the right to organize and bargain collectively. This Egyptian pyramid graphic exemplifies the concept. The structure creates an unregulated work environment whereby trafficking victims are often exploited by their subcontracting supervisors or employers. You might look at this picture and see some guys who can't get work elsewhere, but day labor is often comprised of illegal immigrants and people here as trafficked labor. They owe, like many others, debts to coyotes and organized crime, and that means they'll do whatever they need to get money. Small businesses can perpetuate that problem. They compete in businesses with narrow profit margins or are sometimes just plain greedy. Whatever the reason, the end user of these victims is what drives the human trafficking business. Construction, landscaping, and generally any basic labor business. It may seem like slim pickings to you and I, but organized crime even uses panhandlers to make a buck. After all, why not when it's someone else's sweat and all you need is a little bit of force, fraud, or coercion? Based on the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project's Duluth model, this is a power and control wheel, and it outlines the different types of abuse that can occur in labor and sex trafficking situations. We've covered all these, and I think this is a great graphic of how power and control are at the center, and the spokes are all the ways it's abused. They lead out to the forums where it can be seen and consumed by the public. I'd add one more circle in the middle, though. Money. Perhaps you know someone being trafficked, or maybe it's in your community. Recognizing the potential red flags and knowing the indicators are a key step in identifying more victims and helping them find the assistance they need. We've touched on some, but here we will be more specific. Remember, not all indicators will be present in all situations. The type of trafficking and the content or environment are all important to take into account. But here are 14 clues in living and working. They may not be free to leave or come and go at will. They're under 18 and providing commercial sex acts. They're in the commercial sex industry and have a pimp or manager. They're unpaid or paid very little or paid only through tips. They may work excessively long and or unusual hours. They're not allowed breaks or suffer under unusual restrictions at work. They owe a large debt and they're unable to pay it off. They were recruited through false promises concerning the nature and conditions of their work. There are high security measures in place in the work or the living conditions. They were living and working in the same place. We touched on brothels, but that could also be construction sites. Experience verbal or physical abuse by their supervisor. They're not given proper safety equipment. They may not be paid directly, or they're forced to meet daily quotas. Moving on to mental health and abnormal behavior. Usually your gut will tell you when these behaviors are above normal levels. These may be especially noticeable to their established friends and acquaintances, but they may be fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, tense, or nervous and paranoid. They may exhibit unusually fearful or anxious behavior after someone brings up law enforcement or immigration officials. They may show signs of substance abuse or addiction. As healthcare providers, assessing physical health should be our forte, and we should have no problem picking up on these cues. Poor hygiene or malnourishment, signs of physical or sexual abuse, physical restraint, confinement, or torture. Keep your eyes open for frequent treatment for sexually transmitted infections, a high number of sex partners, multiple pregnancies or abortions, exposure to toxic chemicals, long untreated dental issues, bruises and burns, signs of self-harm, a sudden loss in weight, that's malnourishment, respiratory issues, suicide attempts, and physical and sexual abuse. Lack of control. I'm suggesting someone else being in control. You may not meet them, but they are having a steel grip on the victim's actions. Till now, we've been looking for indicators from the victim. These are the calling cards of the manipulator. They may require that the victim have few or no personal possessions. They're frequently monitored. They're not in control of their own money or finances. Not in control of their ID or passport. And not allowed to speak for themselves or require a translator, even if they speak the local language, English. There are some other signs to discuss outside these. They blur into other behavioral issues like drug addiction and physical abuse as separate issues from when they're part of a trafficking scenario. And I don't mean to minimize those, but only point out that they're outside this scope. There may be claims of just visiting and the inability to clarify where they are staying. They don't have any knowledge of the whereabouts or maybe not even know what city they're in. They appear to have lost a sense of time. And they share a scripted, confusing, or inconsistent story. They may even protect the person who's been physically hurting them or minimize their abuse. The longer that you interact with the individual, the more obvious these types of signs would become. Statistics are from Florida exclusively, and they're from the human trafficking hotline, so they only reflect what the hotline has picked up. They are, however, doing the most to try and stop trafficking and appear to have the highest profile in Florida. So these numbers don't reflect everything happening in Florida, but their reporting is significant. They've identified nearly 2,000 people that were victims of human trafficking in 2018 alone. They identified 506 unique traffickers and 306 businesses. Here in Florida, In 2018, at least 2 new cases every day happened out of the year. Think about it. How many investigators would it take to stay in front of this? Remember, this is only in Florida, and Florida is ranked third behind California and Texas. The problem is staggering in size. Sex trafficking remains the largest problem with nearly 600 cases identified. Labor were 127, but those could be underreported due to the relative isolation of farming communities. And an additional 58 cases did not have a specified form. Florida has two things similar to the other two of the top 3 trafficking states: a long coastal border and multiple ports of entry. Here you can see the map shows hotspots at every major port. Although great progress has been made in fighting human trafficking, there are still many obstacles to navigate when trying to understand the scope of the problem. In each state, there are multiple agencies offering to help human trafficking victims, but they are not always working together in their efforts. There is very little standardization for data being collected, and depending on the state, it may require the victim remain anonymous. This is partly due to the victim's rights and partly due to HIPAA laws. Some non-governmental organizations, NGOs, feel no obligation to report or are too understaffed to create the type of documentation that could be useful to larger umbrella agencies at the state or federal level. Other NGOs that are reporting may be counting the same people who have sought assistance at multiple agencies. So while government agencies continue to issue annual reports on the number of people being trafficked, by their own acknowledgement they have no idea what the true numbers are. Political and social strife and upheaval only serve the traffickers, allowing them cover to further their illicit business, while already thin judicial and administrative services are reallocated to other more high-profile domestic needs. What we are learning from the statistics that are available is that the most at-risk demographic is girls under the age of 17. Sex trafficking tops the list by a giant margin. People, men and women, that the girls are already acquainted with are often implicated. The highest activity for trafficking is where easy access to ports or highways exist. Corridors to other countries and states are used to move victims quickly away from familiar surroundings. The life expectancy of an individual being trafficked on average is 7 years. Health and mental health workers are the 2 professions most likely to come into contact with trafficked individuals by a margin of 3 to 1 against most other professions. About half of trafficked individuals come in contact with the health industry here in the United States. This contact may be only once, which is why this training is so important. Will the healthcare provider be able to respond appropriately? Even with all the resources we have committed, the deterrents don't seem to be severe enough to prevent opportunistic people from preying on their fellow man or woman, as the case may be. Vulnerable populations need to be protected. There have been earlier efforts to combat human trafficking, beginning with the Mann Act of 1910. Before then, prostitution was considered in many big cities as a problem that one held their nose as they passed by. Periodic updates to that act have helped target more offenders. The Trafficking Victims Prevention Act of 2000, known by the acronym TVPA, was the first new federal law to address trafficking. It has long arms, which is to say it can reach into other countries around the globe via the State Department. They can raise awareness in foreign countries so fewer people get tricked into trafficking. It also is able to create an interagency task force to monitor and combat trafficking. The Act also allocated money for shelters and rehabilitation programs, and it provided relief for some victims who feared being deported when they left their trafficking environment through what's known now as the T visa. For the traffickers, the Act upped the ante. The punishment to traffic was now potentially life in prison. This initial act allocated $95 million over the course of 2 years. In 2003, the Trafficking Victims Prevention Reauthorization Act provided the funds, now more than $200 million, needed to continue TVPA for another 2 years. One notable addition to the act was that victims could now sue their perpetrators in criminal court. In 2005, another reauthorization was required, a new budget of $300 million over 2 years to be exact. Earlier efforts had gone into preventing international trafficking at the expense of domestic trafficking. Key provisions now included a requirement for the Attorney General to conduct a national study on the illegal commercial sex industry in the U.S., including the prevalence of severe forms of trafficking and sex trafficking in the U.S., and the approach to combat these crimes by law enforcement. Establishing a grant program for states and local law enforcement to investigate and prosecute acts of severe forms of trafficking, the ones that involve U.S. citizens or legal residents, and criminals who purchase commercial sex acts within the United States. Provide U.S. courts with jurisdiction over federal government employees and contractors for trafficking offenses committed abroad. And the grants could also be used to expand or develop programs to end the demand for victims. In 2008, the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act was passed and got the executive branch involved. It directs the president to create a system to monitor anti-trafficking efforts and programs at the federal level. It also strengthens the role and authority of the Trafficking in Persons Office. The rule book for prosecution was also updated. Some examples are: prosecutors no longer have to prove that a defendant knew the victim was a minor. They just need to show that a defendant had a reasonable opportunity to observe the victim. The standard of proof is lowered to reckless disregard for traffickers or defendants who come into contact with victims forced to engage in commercial sex. It expands criminal liability to anyone financially benefiting or receiving anything of value from any federal trafficking crime, as long as they had the required level of knowledge, and mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years, and requiring no proof of fraud, force, or coercion for convictions. This battle is expensive. This renewal authorizes $2 million per year for 4 years, and additional benefits for human trafficking victims. To carry out the purpose of Section 107F of the renewal, there are authorized to be appropriated to the Secretary of Health and Human Services $2.5 million for fiscal year 2008, $5 million for 2009, $7 million for fiscal year 2010, and then $7 million again for fiscal year 2011. The Attorney General is also receiving funds through this act to the tune of $21.5 million over 4 years. The more you read, the more money you find tucked away in the act. In 2014, a new act was passed into law, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which was aimed at protecting children and youth that were at risk of being sex trafficked while they were in the state's welfare and adoption system. These are all federal acts passed through Congress. As the battle continues, states from across the country are also now revisiting their criminal codes as well to make human trafficking penalties tougher than ever. While seeking to slow the flow of human trafficking through stiffer penalties is a logical place to begin, it also needs to be considered who we're dealing with. In many cases, today's human trafficking is a multi-million-dollar business operated by the same organizations that pour billions of dollars of illegal drugs into our country. They are organized, they are well-funded, and they are ruthless. Our education to the matter is primary, but turning the tide of public sentiment against these practices, if it can be done, would be the ultimate weapon. This is where you come in. The grassroots effort starts here with education and continued awareness and an intolerance of the situation. It's no longer feasible to look the other way and hope that someone else will report it. Speaking of intolerance to the situation, the current trial and adjudication of Ghislaine Maxwell may be the most high-profile human trafficking case to date, and deservedly so. Testimony has revealed there were hundreds of victims. Unfortunately, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Miss Maxwell has been convicted, but no names or arrests have been made of the many others that were involved. As we've seen from this video and the home study book, there are many facilitators involved as well as the end users. If we believe in the rule of law and justice, then everyone involved, regardless of their social status, needs to be prosecuted and held accountable. There is a small window of opportunity here to set an example and a standard for future Maxwells, Epsteins, and their kind, who opportunistically prey on the vulnerable in our society. Fortunately, there is a bright spot in this dark topic, a silver lining, if you will. More people than ever before are aware of the problem and are willing to lend a hand in stopping it. New organizations have sprung up with volunteers to aid victims and others to track the money. We can be sure these organizations are successful by pulling our own weight in this fight, and if you feel called to volunteer, opportunities abound. I'm going to review the names of some departments and organizations that can help in the fight, that are helping in the fight. I'll review these for possible use later on. After our review of the acts and the funds allocated by them, we owe it to the victims to make ourselves familiar with these resources. The Department of Homeland Security. They have links to the DHS Center for Countering Human Trafficking, as well as their Blue campaign, which is a national public awareness campaign designed to educate the public, vulnerable communities, law enforcement, and other industry partners to recognize the indicators of human trafficking and how to appropriately respond to possible cases. Human Trafficking Search, an international site that spreads the word about international abuses. They seek to raise awareness with their database and an ongoing blog. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center, for people who are trafficked. They have a 24-hour hotline. The National Institute of Justice. They're committed to assisting with the detection and prosecution of human traffickers and to supporting the recovery of victims of human trafficking. The Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's a site for states to access help for their local programs. The Office for Victims of Crime, committed to enhancing the nation's capacity to assist crime victims and to provide leadership in changing attitudes, policies, and practices to promote justice and healing for all victims of crime. The Office on Trafficking in Persons, an intermediary between the federal government and local assistance programs. Polaris, a human trafficking statistics and hotline for victims. We've cited them in the presentation. Shared Hope International. That's a good site that gives a report card with a breakdown for each state. Very interactive website. I think you'd like it. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, an international organization that focuses on education and reporting of criminal activity. The U.S. Department of Justice, their mission statement, to enforce the law and defend the interests of the United States according to the law, to ensure public safety against threats foreign and domestic, to provide federal leadership in preventing and controlling crime, to seek just punishment for those guilty of unlawful behavior, and to ensure fair and impartial administration of justice for all Americans. The U.S. Department of State partners with foreign governments, international organizations, other federal agencies, civil society, and the private sector, and survivors of human trafficking in order to develop and implement effective strategies to confront modern slavery. Finally, a Twitter account, VS Confronts on Twitter. They are a Twitter account that has links to news articles. How can you help? Well, it's true. Once you see, you can never unsee. And we talk about this concept in other classes, but it's usually about gait patterns and postural analysis. In this case, we're talking about the signs of human trafficking. Remarkably, as I was writing this over several weeks, I was also watching TV and movies online with no particular idea of looking for film that related to human trafficking. But there are images and videos about this topic around us all the time. TV shows and movies are not a commentary on our violence towards one another. I believe they are the emotional and psychological desensitization to real life. One example recently cashed in was Last Blood by and starring Sylvester Stallone. It's stylized to match his franchise character, but there is a great deal of footage that matches exactly what I've talked about today. Unfortunately, there's no acknowledgement before or after the movie about how real these crimes are, or ways to get help. Because of that, most people who watch will only digest it as another movie from the Rambo franchise. What we've studied today is real, and it's happening all around us. Not only should we see something, say something, we should consider our own safety and the perceptions that get imprinted on our profession by others' behavior. If you know someone or have heard about someone that may be a victim, take these numbers, pass them on, or make the call yourself. Remember what Edmund Burke said. There are industries that feed into or support human trafficking. Industries that cheapen or damage our relationships with the people around us and the ones we love. Take some time and read the articles on fightthenewdrug.org and see for yourself. There are over 50 studies tying pornography to sexual violence. They're not paying me for this. I'm just referring you to a good site for your continued study. Thank you for this time together, and I hope you feel like you learned something you can take away and share with others. Something that's heightened your awareness and makes you want to lend a hand to your fellow human being. We're all in this together and should do what we can to make each other's lives a little better. What you can do doesn't take that much effort.